I was flown into Murmansk under cover of night, strapped into a military-grade transport jet with no insignia and windows so blacked out I couldn't even see the wingtips. Not that it mattered. I wasn't here to enjoy the scenery. They didn't tell me where we were going. They never do. The fewer coordinates I know, the easier it is to deny everything later. That's how it works in the line of contract work I do. Specialized reconnaissance for governments who officially have no interest in unclaimed territories. Most of the time, it's mineral rights or obsolete Cold War bunkers buried in ice. This time felt different. From the moment I touched down, the air buzzed with something off. Not tension, not hostility, something older, like the ground itself was holding its breath. Two men in military Arctic gear greeted me on the tarmac without a word. No salutes, no welcome, just a shared glance that said we all hate this assignment. I was handed a thermal suit and a Geiger counter. That was the second red flag. The first was the letter, a physical one, typed on a 1950s machine, sealed in wax. It arrived at my doorstep 2 weeks ago. No return address, just coordinates, my name, and 4 words, bring what you remember. I don't talk about what happened in Volgograd. The ride from the airstrip to Base Zero took 7 hours, crawling in a snow crawler through wide-out winds that sandblasted the windows like they wanted in. I kept looking at the soldier across from me, Russian, square-jawed, dead-eyed, but he never blinked. I tried making conversation once. He muttered, "It's sleeping. Don't wake it," then refused to speak again. By the time we reached the camp, my skin itched under the suit, and I could taste copper with every breath. The sky above was smeared, gray on gray, and the wind didn't howl so much as hum, low and constant like a bad frequency just below the human hearing range. Base Zero wasn't much. 3 prefabs, a comms dish, and a reinforced dome sunk halfway into the ice. No flag, no unit markings, not even footprints in the snow. There were 5 of us. Dr. Leanne Kavinsky, a linguist from Warsaw, pale as death and always writing in a notebook she never let anyone see. Her hands trembled constantly. She said it was nerve damage. I didn't believe her. Igor and Petrov, the Russian soldiers, built like Cold War tanks and just as silent. Then there was me, Alexei Moran, former U.S. Army, geological survey turned Black Op consultant after my discharge. I don't dream anymore. Haven't for years. The man in charge of the operation didn't introduce himself. He was waiting inside the dome, watching us on a wall of flickering monitors. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month. Gray stubble, one eye bloodshot, the other covered by a lens that whirred when he moved. "Read this," he said, handing me a printout. It was satellite imaging. Thermal scans. Anomalous readings buried beneath the ice shelf, too deep to be natural. And it was radiating heat. That wasn't the strange part. It was shaped like a perfect hexagon, 40 meters across, embedded under nearly a mile of solid glacial ice. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. We thought it was geothermal, the man said, until it started changing shape. I looked at him. He nodded. "It's alive." I should have walked out right then. We set out the next morning before dawn. Snow beat against our suits like angry insects, and the light from the sun was filtered through clouds so thick it looked like twilight. We carried no firearms, strict orders. Something about not provoking resonance. I didn't ask. Igor carried the portable drill. Petrov had the signal beacon. Leanne and I carried the sensor array. It took 6 hours to reach the scan coordinates. It was nothing but white, until we saw it. A single obsidian spike jutted from the snow, slick and sharp like a tooth punching through flesh. It shouldn't have been there. No snow clung to it. No ice. It steamed, actually gave off heat and air, so cold our eyelashes froze. I touched it. My glove hissed. There were markings, etched patterns that moved slightly when you weren't looking straight at them. Symbols that looked like a fusion of cuneiform and circuitry. They weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be felt. "This wasn't made," Leanne said. "It was grown." She traced a spiral with her gloved finger and muttered something under her breath. I didn't catch it. We began the drill sequence. Heat lance first, then the bore shaft. It took hours. Beneath the snow, the spike continued downward like a root system, converging on the buried hexagon. At 900 meters, the drill struck something that wasn't ice. It screamed. I know how that sounds. Drills don't scream. But this one did. Metal on bone, or something pretending to be bone. It vibrated through the ground, through our boots, through our skulls. Petrov dropped to his knees and vomited blood. Igor's nose bled. Leanne collapsed completely, clutching her ears and sobbing. And me? I heard something else beneath the scream. My name. The shaft revealed a tunnel. Smooth, black, sloping downward. No seams. No signs of tool work. It was like the mountain itself had grown hollow and waited. We should have gone back, but we went in. We rappelled into the darkness, the only sound our breath and the distant drip of something we couldn't see. I kept flashing back to a dream I hadn't remembered having, standing in a hallway that looked just like this one, with lights like dying stars overhead and a door at the end that never opened. The descent took 40 minutes. We reached a platform that opened into a vast chamber, the air thick and humid. It smelled like rust, mold, and ozone. My mouth tasted like pennies. My tongue went numb. Lights flickered on by themselves. Hexagonal walls, 30 feet high, curved overhead. The architecture looked insectoid, organic but not grown. Engineered biology. That's the only way I can describe it. Jesus Christ, Igor muttered. It was the first thing he'd said all day. The walls pulsed softly, as if breathing. My skin began to itch under the thermal suit. Something about the pressure down here was wrong, like we were deeper than the earth allowed. We moved forward. Leanne stopped every few feet to copy symbols on her notepad, even as her hand shook. These aren't warnings, she said, voice barely audible over the low hum. They're sentences. Meaning what? I asked. She looked up. This isn't a facility. It's a verdict. Something moved in the shadows ahead. A figure. Just for a second. I drew a flashlight and swept it across the chamber. Nothing. But Igor had already raised his weapon against orders. He didn't lower it. We reached the central door. It was massive, 20 feet tall, made of the same black material. No hinges, no seams, just the outline of a doorway and a single handprint-shaped recess. It was human-sized. I looked at the others. No one moved, so I stepped forward. The instant my glove touched it, heat surged through me. Not fire, memory. I saw a battlefield of stars. I heard languages that split atoms. I felt myself scream as time collapsed and rebuilt around a single idea: containment. The door began to open. Inside was a narrow hall lined with empty niches. Not cells, slots. Each one had clamps, cables, something that looked like neural scaffolding. There were stains on the floor. Old but not ancient. We moved cautiously, adrenaline smothering the cold. Leanne stopped in front of one of the niches. There were scratches on the inside. She read them aloud. He screamed until the world ended. Then they brought him back. A new noise filled the air. Breathing. Not ours. We turned. The end of the corridor was darker than the rest. And from that darkness, something stepped forward. It looked human, at first. Then the light hit it, and I realized it wasn't wearing a suit. Its skin was metallic, smooth, liquid and solid at the same time. Its eyes glowed from within, not light, but depth, like peering into a well that never ends. Its mouth didn't move, but I heard a voice. You opened the first door, it said. You were always going to. Igor raised his rifle. Don't, I whispered, but he fired. The bullet never hit. It stopped midair and slowly rotated, then turned back toward him. He didn't have time to scream. The air rippled. Then Igor's body folded in half like a paperclip, every bone snapping at once. Blood froze mid-spray and shattered on the ground like glass. We ran. No one looked back, not even once. By the time we reached the surface, the sun was gone. Not set, gone. The sky was black, the stars wrong. The wind had stopped. Everything was silent. Petrov felt his knees and started sobbing. I didn't comfort him, because the monolith was changing. The spike had grown, now as tall as a building and pulsing. The carvings glowed faintly, in colors I had no name for. The air felt thick, wet. Leanne stood motionless, staring at the shape with tears in her eyes. I've seen this before, she said. In a dream I don't remember having. The comms crackled to life. It wasn't base 0. It was a child's voice, speaking in perfect English. "Don't let it see you," it said. "Don't let it remember." The transmission cut, and the monolith pulsed again. The cold had changed. It wasn't just temperature anymore. It was something inside the cold, like an intelligence watching from every snowflake, listening through the air. The kind of cold that didn't numb you, but searched you. We didn't speak for nearly an hour after the comms went dead. Not even Petrov, who was still shaking like something was trying to crawl out of his skin. The sun never rose. The sky stayed black, yet not starless. Those weren't stars above us anymore. They shifted subtly, pulsed, reacted, like they were looking back. I ran diagnostics on our sensors. They all gave conflicting data. Barometer thought we were 10 kilometers above sea level. Thermometer cycled between -40 and 87 Celsius. GPS was gone entirely. We were somewhere, just not here. Petrov finally broke the silence, voice low and glassy. "Clock doesn't move." I looked. He was right. My watch had stopped. Not dead, just paused. The second hand hovered between ticks. "We need to get back to base 0, I said. No one argued. Leon didn't move. She stood in front of the monolith, eyes fixed upward. Her lips moved, silently forming words I couldn't hear. I touched her shoulder. She flinched so hard she nearly screamed, then whispered, "It's not a prison." "What?" She looked at me, pupils blown wide. "It's a tombstone. The names, they aren't warnings. They're apologies." We left. The journey back took twice as long, though the terrain was exactly the same. Every step sank deeper than the last. The horizon bent. The crawler, still where we left it, was covered in a thin layer of frost, despite no snowfall. When we opened the door, the cabin smelled wrong. Not just musty aged, like it had been sealed for 100 years. We checked the interior. Everything untouched. Fuel full. Equipment in place. One thing had changed. The date on the dashboard read February 9th. We left base 0 on January 13th. Leanne checked her satellite phone. The battery was bloated, like it had been left plugged in for weeks. The screen was cracked, and when she turned it on, it flickered through static, then a single image. A still frame of us, standing in the tunnel. Except there were 6 figures. The 6th was behind me. No face, just a silhouette. Watching. No one said a word. We started the engine and drove. As we approached the base, something gnawed at the edge of my memory. A sound, faint and low, like a whisper caught in the wind. Then I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was chanting. Too faint to distinguish words, but rhythmic. Repeating, growing louder the closer we got. When we arrived, we found the prefabs still standing. But the dome had collapsed. Or rather, it had imploded, like something inside had pulled inward, dragging every steel rib and screw into a single blackened crater. No debris, no fire, just absence. Petrov got out first, weapon drawn. He didn't care about the orders anymore. "Comm station," I said. Maybe something got out. We moved quickly. The snow around the dome had a scorched look. Black spirals burned into it, too precise to be accidental. Inside the comms prefab, the equipment was mostly intact, but the monitors were all on. Each displayed different camera angles. Some of them weren't from our base. One showed an endless hallway, slick with something wet. Another, a room full of machinery that seemed to pulse with breath. And one, God help me, showed the sky above us, but from an impossible altitude, as if filmed by something looking down from orbit. In that feed, we saw ourselves. Tiny figures walking toward the comm shack. Then, suddenly, the feed cut to static. The other screens followed. The door slammed shut behind us. Petrov spun, rifle up. No one there. The door creaked open on its own. Leanne whispered, "It's testing us." "What?" I said, like a lens flare. "The equipment. It's not malfunctioning, it's being observed. Like it's running simulations of us." She opened her notebook and flipped to a page she hadn't written. It was filled with symbols. The same ones we'd seen in the tunnel, burned into the paper. Not ink, heat damage. She ran her fingers over them, eyes wide. "I didn't write this." The lights flickered. We decided to leave the base behind and make for the extraction point. 20 kilometers south, where our helicopter was scheduled to rotate supplies in 5 days. Assuming time still worked, we loaded the crawler and left just after what we guessed was nightfall. 15 kilometers in, the engine died. No warning, just silence. We climbed out. The air was thicker now, like breathing through wool. Even the cold had changed again. Not sharp, heavy. Feel that? I asked. Petrov nodded. Air's wrong. Gravity, Leanne said. I tested a drop of water from the canteen. It didn't fall. It drifted lazily, as if the laws had forgotten themselves. That's when we saw the lights. Faint at first, like distant searchlights sweeping slowly across the ice. But they weren't attached to anything. They came from below the surface. Lines of illumination in perfect hexagons, forming a vast network beneath us. Like we were walking on the roof of something buried and enormous. I stepped carefully. The moment my boot landed on a glowing seam, the ice cracked. But it didn't break. It peeled, smoothly, silently. A section of the glacier just folded downward like the lid of an eye opening. And beneath it, metal, dark, oily, curved in ways that hurt the brain to stare at. Vents opened, not letting air out, pulling it in. The air pressure dropped suddenly. Ears popped. Petrov staggered and bled from his nose again. Then we heard it. A low-frequency vibration that wasn't sound. It was thought. A wave of emotion. Anger. Regret. Hunger. From a hole in the ice, something rose. It wasn't large. Maybe 7 feet tall. Humanoid. But its body was a collection of shifting plates, always moving, reshaping. No face. Just impressions of faces that flickered across its surface like a broken screen, trying to remember what human meant. Petrov aimed. No, I said. Don't. It wants you to. But he fired. The sound never echoed. The bullets froze midair, just like before. This time, they rotated faster. Petrov started to scream, then stopped. He wasn't dead. He just wasn't there anymore. The space he occupied was empty. And not just spatially, conceptually. Like the idea of him had been erased. My brain still remembered him. My eyes didn't. I turned to Leanne. Tears streamed down her face. It's not killing us, she whispered. It's learning us. Deconstructing. Reconstructing. Seeing what happens when it rewrites. The thing began to move toward us. I didn't wait. I grabbed Leanne and ran. We didn't make it far before the air folded again. Not physically. Chronologically. I saw her stumble, then stand, then stumble again, 3 times in a flicker. My own hand moved twice in opposite directions. We'd entered time pocket. The creature didn't follow, because it didn't have to. It already seen us. In one scene it could edit. We crawled into a crevasse and waited. The lights faded after an hour. The stars above remained wrong. The sky, still black. The clock on my wrist ticked once every 10 minutes. I looked at Leanne. We can't go back to the surface, she said. That's not the real danger. What is? She showed me her notebook again. The symbols had shifted. Now they were English. The prisoners are waking. She turned the page. A new message burned into it. Right at the center. You are one of them. I stared at her. She didn't blink. Then, in the softest voice possible, she said, Alexei, what happened in Volgograd? The question froze me. Because I didn't remember. Not really. Just flashes. Screams. A room with no walls. Wires in my spine. Blood that wasn't red. But the memory wasn't from war. It was from something before that. Something deeper. The realization hit me like ice water. Volgograd wasn't a mission. It was a recovery. I wasn't there to stop something. I was what they pulled out. Leanne was still looking at me. Her hand trembled over her notes. And now I noticed the burn marks weren't just on the paper. They were on her fingers. We sat in silence, the dark pressing in. Above us, the lights stirred again. Only this time, they weren't beneath the ice. They were in the sky, moving, searching. The snow around our hiding place began to melt. Not from heat, but absence. Like reality was being carved out piece by piece. Leanne leaned close and whispered something into my ear. Only I couldn't hear it, because it wasn't sound. It was code, and I understood it. The moment I did, I felt something shift behind my eyes, like a door creaking open. And I knew, with absolute certainty, I had been here before. Many, many times, and I had never made it out. The section ended not with a scream, not with a chase, but with a simple, soul-shattering thought that settled like snow. I was never supposed to remember. We woke to a sound that didn't belong in snow. Metal, grinding, rhythmic, not from above, but inside the ice. Leanne was already sitting up, eyes wide, hands gripping her notebook like it was an anchor to reality. The notebook had changed again. Pages torn, words smeared, symbols scratched in with something sharper than a pen. She looked at me like she'd seen something that couldn't be unseen. "It's moving underneath us," she said. "Like veins." We'd taken shelter inside a natural ice cavern, its crystalline walls casting faint reflections of our own distorted faces. Except, there were too many reflections. One extra, always just out of sync, smiling when we weren't, blinking at the wrong times. I stopped looking at the walls. Our breath hung in the air like smoke, not dissipating, hanging, watching. I knew we couldn't stay. We followed the noise deeper into the crevasse. The geometry made no sense. Straight paths curved, descents rose, distances collapsed into impossible intersections. Leanne scribbled everything, even when the symbols made her nose bleed. "I don't know who's writing anymore," she said once, "but they remember me." At some point, time lost meaning entirely. Watches stopped. Hunger faded. No thirst. Our skin dried and cracked, but we kept moving like marionettes. The tunnels gave way to something else. Walls of metal grown like coral, glowing veins running through them. This wasn't ice. It was an interface. A hallway opened before us, pitch black, and we knew it wasn't carved. It was open for us. We stepped through. Inside, the air was thick. Breathing it felt like inhaling memories, not your own. Images pulsed at the edge of perception. Civilizations that rose and fell before Earth cooled. Wars fought not with weapons, but with concepts, erasing entire timelines. The hallway descended, and it was familiar. I'd seen it. In my dreams. In Volgograd. And once, during a blackout in the Mojave, when I stared too long into a power station's humming heart and swore I heard whispering. "I think I was born here," I said aloud. Leanne didn't laugh. She just nodded. At the bottom of the passage was a door. Smooth, black, seamless. The same as before, but taller, towering. It pulsed once, and a section dissolved silently. Inside was a cathedral. No altar, no benches, just space. And something in the middle. It hovered, oblong, translucent, filled with drifting points of light. A cocoon, maybe, or a pod. Inside it floated a humanoid shape, curled in fetal position. Skinless, genderless, covered in shifting patterns like circuitry etched into muscle. Its eyes were open. So were mine, because it looked like me. Leanne made a sound, choked horror, and stepped back. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't you." She turned a page in the notebook. It was blank, but she wrote a single line. "You're not a clone. You're a container." I stepped forward against every instinct. The pod responded, glowing brighter. Then I heard it, not with ears, in my bones. You were the echo of a memory that forgot its name. The lights flickered. The chamber pulsed. Something was waking. The walls began to vibrate, low and deep like tectonic plates shifting. Suddenly the floor opened beneath us. We fell. No scream, no sound, just falling, but not downward. Inward, through time, through versions of ourselves. I saw 1,000 Leannes, all dead in different ways. Burned, disintegrated, folded inside out. And I saw myself in 1,000 rooms, staring at the same pod. Each time, I looked older, more broken, more aware. Then, impact. I hit solid ground, gasping like I hadn't breathed in centuries. We were back in a corridor. The cocoon was gone. The cathedral was gone. But something had changed. Leanne was bleeding from her ears, eyes unfocused. "Did we die?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. And I didn't. Around us, the walls flickered. Reality hiccuped. The lights didn't illuminate so much as hide things, by lighting only what we were meant to see. Then the door behind us opened again, and a figure stepped through. But this wasn't like the others. It didn't shimmer. It was solid. Male. Uniformed. American. My own face. Older. He looked tired. Eyes sunken. Skin paper thin. Finally, he said, "Took you long enough." I didn't move. "You know who I am?" he said. I nodded. "I'm the one who made it back," he said. "Ow!" By not trying to escape. He stepped forward and tapped the wall beside us. A panel opened, smooth and glowing. It showed images, snapshots of Earth, fractured and fading. Wars. Plagues. Then blackness. "This place isn't a prison," he said. "It's a vault. A failsafe." "For what?" Leanne asked. He looked at her, sadness in his face. "For the ones who lost the war. The real war. The one outside time. The prisoners." He shook his head. "No. Us." We stared. "They didn't lose," he said. "We did. Humanity. We cracked open something we couldn't contain. So they did it for us." He pointed to the walls. "These aren't cells. They're reflections. Containment vectors for contaminated realities. Fragments of infected consciousness." "Consciousness?" I asked. He nodded at me. "You're not a person. You're a memory. One corrupted enough to reawaken the infection. That's why they built you." I backed away. "That's not possible." "Then explain this," he said, raising his arm. The skin shimmered. Underneath, wires. Metal. I looked at my own hand. No blood. Just light. My voice cracked. "How many times have we done this?" He looked at me. "Too many." The corridor shook. Screams echoed. Not human. Not mechanical. Something worse. Like a language learning how to scream for the first time. "They're waking up," Leanne said. The other me nodded. "Because you're here. You're the beacon. Your presence reboots the cycle. So shut me down. I've tried. Every time. You always find a way back." He walked forward, held out a device. "Smooth. Cold. Press this. Erase your vector. Maybe this time it sticks." I took it, but something inside me recoiled. A deep animal part. The same one that screams during sleep paralysis. I looked at Leanne. "Do it," she said. "You're not you. You're a mimic, caught in the echo of something older." I stared at the device. Then the walls blinked. A voice, my voice, spoke from everywhere. "Cycle 8231. Fail state reached. Core awareness breached. All mirrors destabilizing." Sirens began to wail in tones that made my teeth ache. The corridor folded. Reality flickered like old film burning. The other me vanished, disintegrated into static. Leanne grabbed my arm. "We need to go." "To where?" She pointed ahead. A door, one I hadn't seen before, was glowing. I saw it in my notebook, just before the words melted. It said, "Final chamber." I didn't argue. We ran. The hallway collapsed behind us, glitching into fragments of dreams. Images from my childhood that weren't mine, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. They whispered as they dissolved. "You were never born." We reached the door. It opened before we touched it. Inside, a small chamber. Circular. Quiet. A pedestal in the middle. On it, a map of Earth, but broken. Fractured into spirals. Timelines peeling outward like petals. One was highlighted. "This one," Leanne said. She touched it. The map shivered, and I felt something move behind my ribs. The walls fell away. The stars appeared, but not our stars. These were older, hungrier. Then a voice, mine again, whispered, "Which version of you will survive?" The pedestal glowed. Two options appeared. 1. Terminate vector. 2. Return TO surface. Leanne looked at me. "You choose." I stared at both, and realized, no matter what I picked, something would escape. I reached out. I pressed the second option. Return to surface. The light from the pedestal surged, and for a fraction of a second, I felt my body come apart. Every cell, every thought, pulled like threads through a needlepoint of screaming stars. Then silence. Then the taste of blood. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the snow. Sky above, gray, heavy, familiar. Leanne was beside me, curled up, shivering. Her face was pale, lips cracked, eyes open but distant. For a moment, I thought we'd made it. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Not boots. Not human. Something dragging. Something deliberate. Crunching over snow with a rhythm that suggested familiarity with the terrain and with us. I helped Leanne up. She blinked slowly, like her thoughts were lagging behind her body. What did you choose? She asked. I looked at the sky. It didn't answer. The crawler was gone. No dome in sight. No base. No signal. We stood on a blank tundra of pure white that stretched in every direction, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a stage, waiting for actors to remember their lines. And then the sky blinked. Just once, like a camera shutter, and something changed. The sun was in the wrong place. The horizon curved too sharply. I realized we weren't on Earth anymore. We were in a reconstruction of it. A model. An echo. The facility hadn't let us leave. It had let us believe we left. Leanne gripped my arm. She pointed ahead. A figure stood on the ice. Alone. Distant. Watching. It was me. Again. But not me. Too tall. Too still. Its arms hung unnaturally. Its head tilted sideways with a slow, mechanical motion, like a machine trying to understand a mirror. Then it moved. Toward us. Not walking, gliding. The snow didn't shift beneath it. We ran. No plan. No direction. Just pure, survival-driven motion. I felt the landscape shift as we ran. Ice cracking, folding, rearranging to corral us. The entity didn't chase us. It guided us. Leanne tripped. I caught her. She grabbed her notebook, even now, even in panic. Pages fluttered. Symbols danced. Then we reached it. A door. Standing alone in the snow. A freestanding frame of black metal, embedded into nothing. It pulsed softly. This is the real one, Leanne said. Final gate. No simulations. How do you know? She turned a page. It was blank except for one word. Exit. The sound behind us grew louder. Chanting, layered voices rising like a chorus underwater. Familiar syllables. My name. Her name. Over and over, then backwards, then inside out. We stepped through. There was no tunnel. Only darkness. And then heat. Blinding, suffocating, alive. We were back in the main chamber. The cathedral of containment. The cocoon was gone. In its place, a hole. Not a pit. Not a tunnel. A hole in space. A perfect absence. No light escaped it. No heat. Even sound bent away. Leanne stumbled forward. This was the plan, she whispered. They made us believe we had choices. But we were just waking it up. I grabbed her shoulder. We have to go. No, she said, stepping away. We can't leave. Not without sealing it. And how do we do that? She held up her notebook. I have the key. Pages turned by themselves, faster and faster, until one stopped on a diagram. It wasn't writing. It was a sequence. A ritual. A neurological pattern. I'm going to give it my memory, she said. My entire identity. If I do, it might close. Might. She smiled, lips trembling. That's the closest we've ever come. Leanne, she handed me the notebook. Keep it. If I disappear, you'll remember me. Before I could stop her, she stepped toward the hole. It noticed her. The air warped. The walls trembled. From inside the void, limbs began to reach. Limbs of black thought, made from fragments of forgotten gods. Leanne didn't flinch. She spoke in a tongue I didn't know I knew. And the hole paused. The tendrils stopped. Time stopped. And she walked in. She didn't scream. She didn't fade. She just ceased. The hole collapsed. Slowly, quietly, like a breath being released. And then it was gone. So was she. I stood there for what could have been seconds or days. Then I opened the notebook. The pages were blank. Not erased. Purged. No trace of her. No trace of the sequence. No name. I left the chamber. The facility didn't resist me. Not this time. As I ascended, the structure pulsed with a strange rhythm. Less like a machine, more like a heartbeat or a sigh. Something settling back into sleep. At the top, I found a ladder. Metal. Cold. I climbed and emerged into sunlight. Real sunlight. Sky blue. Birds overhead. Snow melting. Normality. Or close enough. I walked for hours before a satellite relay picked up my emergency beacon. Rescue arrived within the day. They asked questions. I gave answers. Simplified ones. The Russians denied any knowledge. No mention of Base Zero existed in any database. No team manifests. No Leanne. Just me. In a blank notebook. They sent me home. I didn't protest. Weeks passed. I don't sleep much. I keep the notebook on my nightstand. It's still blank. Except this morning, one word appeared. Remember. And below it, she's still there. I don't know if this is the end. I don't know if this is even real. But sometimes in the dark, when the house is still and my thoughts drift, I hear a voice. Not screaming, not crying, just repeating the same phrase over and over from somewhere beyond the stars. We weren't supposed to wake them. And somewhere far beneath the ice, the heartbeat begins again.